If you don't know who I am already, I'm Rachel. I'm one of the counselors here at YSI. And we are kind of starting up with our YS research program, which is super exciting. So today I'm kind of just going to be giving an overview on independent research in general, what research looks like, etc. So um, let's just get started. Okay, so what we're going to cover today in this workshop is what is research, why do research, what the scientific method is, and getting started on your own projects. If you have questions, feel free to just raise your little Zoom hand at any point, but I also will leave some time at the end for questions as well. Okay, so starting off with what is research? So research is a process of systematic inquiry that entails collection of data, documentation of critical information, analysis and interpretation of that data information in accordance with suitable methodologies set by specific professional fields and academic disciplines. That is a lot of words, so I'm going to break it down. So what is research? First, we start here, a process of systematic inquiry, which basically means that research is a process that follows predetermined steps to answer some sort of question, right? That's kind of the baseline of what you do research, how you do research, what that consists of, right? And there are many steps, and we'll cover that when we talk about the scientific method. But again, that's the baseline, the fundamental, right? And what are part of these steps? That's going to be collection of data and documentation of critical information, right? Gathering pieces of information and writing them down. We'll talk a little bit too about like what different types of pieces of data you can collect as well. Analysis and interpretation of that data and information. So that means research requires looking at that information, understanding it, drawing conclusions. So when you are, doing a research project, it's not just, oh, all this information is really cool. That's learning, right? But the research part of it is bringing these things together, drawing conclusions, looking at all of it, analyzing it, right? And then the final part, in accordance with suitable methodologies set by specific professional fields and academic disciplines. So research requires knowing the right way to approach the process based off previous research and science. And so it's good that you're here, right? Because if we start an independent research project without knowing, the right way to start something, the ethical way to start something, then you can make some really bad missteps. And I would just really want to emphasize that, making sure that you have experienced mentor when you're working through these research projects is really, really important because, you want to make sure that you're doing things not only in an ethical way, just morally, but also because you can get in trouble, right? For not doing research that is, ethically consistent, for not doing research that follows a specific, methodology, right? If I'm going to go and collect a bunch of data, I can't just, have unsterile equipment, etc., right? If I was going to catch a bunch of dragonflies, I have to make sure they're not protected. So we have to be really, really critically, important of the research we're doing and make sure that when we are setting out how we're going to do something, it's in accordance with what's done before. And even when we're building off of that or venturing into completely new territory, we have to be really careful, right? Like doing research is really fun and it's exciting. But it's still important to make sure that we are doing it responsibly. Okay, so all that being said, that was kind of an overview of, what is research? How do we define it? So why do it in the first place? So first and foremost, research teaches really important skills, independent thinking, inquiry, sometimes coding, analysis, and more. So depending on the type of project that you pursue, your research can teach you so much, right? Like that type of project, and speaking from my own experience, right, can teach you a whole number of skills. Sometimes you're just emailing people and you're building up confidence, right? And other times you're actually doing research can teach you a lot of really important skills and can help you in literally any job, I think. And then applications. So colleges really, really like independent research as one of your extracurricular opportunities. So seeing that you're able to not only put forward as some sort of research idea, but to follow through an entire process and have an outcome is really, really impressive. So that's part of why YSI has kind of put together this research program, is to broaden that opportunity for people, to give them, more information, more of an opportunity, and also just to make sure that, we're not just doing this research and being like, okay, cool, I learned this new thing, but also making sure that, we're applying for different research fellowships or applying to certain competitions and things like that, so that there's an outcome here as well that you can put on that application and really strengthen it on top of getting these really key skills. There's 3 different research types that I would kind of categorize, and these are really broad. First is just going to be like novel research, or what I would kind of call like what you would typically think of as research. And so that's essentially exploring new questions and ideas based off of previous research. So when you go and you read a bunch of papers, right, and you pull them all together, you can kind of think, okay, I'll give an example, right? Like they measured, the fat levels in milk over the span of 2 weeks, right, to see if they increased or decreased. And they found this, but I'm actually really interested to see how sugar levels change over time, right? So you're exploring a new question, but you're basing it off of other research. Similarly, a meta-analysis is mostly combining information, drawing or new confirming conclusions. So this is something I could see a lot of people doing, or a lot of, I guess, students doing here, because what meta-analysis really requires is taking a look at, sometimes hundreds of different articles and kind of pulling together all of that information to try and think, what does the field as a whole think of this? So a lot of times when you're gathering baseline information, you'll look at meta-analyses, right? And you'll think, okay, so, based on everything that I've read, it seems like everybody is getting this result, right? It seems like, we found that eating more protein every day leads to better weight loss outcomes, right? Or lower risk of diabetes. So a meta-analysis is a formal way of pulling together all of that information to draw new conclusions or to just confirm conclusions, right? Between all these papers saying, we have evidence to say that 90% of the research we've found has supported this conclusion, which is really important to do. And then the third kind of research type is going to be exploratory research. So exploratory research is going to be, how do I say this? It's exploratory. So it's pushing beyond just novel research. You're trying to learn more about a new area. So maybe you go to try and find, information about a really specific subject area. So I can kind of use some of the research I've done in the past, but I was specifically studying, queer Asian Americans and mental health outcomes. And it was actually really hard for me to find any information on that. I found a couple studies, but none of them were really focused in on this population area. It was really hard to find like answers to the questions that I was specifically asking. So I conducted exploratory research, which essentially means that like I had a lot of freedom in kind of how I wanted to structure my study, how I wanted to kind of draw conclusions. And so I think the thing that's fun about exploratory research is you're kind of delving into something that a lot of people haven't before. But the tough thing is you can't always make a lot of, firm conclusions, but it's kind of wading into the waters of like a new field of study. Okay. So what we'll cover for most of this presentation and what we'll really focus in is the scientific method, is the overview of the research process and every single step of the way, so that you kind of have an idea of, if I sit with Rachel for the next 10 weeks, what are we going to be working on? And like, what do I need help with? What am I going to be doing? Right. So first and foremost, what is the scientific method? So the scientific method is a logical approach for acquiring knowledge through observation and experimentation. Super helpful, I know. So breaking this down a little bit again, the scientific method is essentially a very systematic process that you take step by step, and that's kind of the accepted, I would say, super broad structure of how we do research. So there are kind of what I would say 6-ish steps of the scientific method. You could argue that there's 7 and that I didn't want to make a 7th box here. But kind of the first step is just observe. And then the second question, then we have gathering background, then we have hypothesizing, experimenting, analyzing, and concluding. So we'll go through what each of these mean in a moment, but I think what I really want to emphasize here is when we talk about the scientific method, we're talking about it because I'm really trying to give you an overview of what the entire research process looks like from top to bottom so that you can have an understanding of what you're getting yourself into and kind of what that could look like for you. Okay, so first two steps of the scientific method, you're going to have observe. So make an observation around the world around you, right? For example, you could say that the summer seems to be getting hotter, right? You're going outside and every day you're like, this seems hotter than last summer. I just can't remember it being like this. So then it takes you to step number 2. Ask questions about your observation. Question, right? Are the summers getting hotter? What makes the summer hotter? Can we make the summer cooler? You know, what's causing this? And I think these are, it seems silly to have these as steps, but I think it's really important to think about this process because it's what you'll start what you'll start your project with, and what you'll actually spend a lot of time doing is just kind of exploring and questioning and trying to pull together some sort of like formal research question, right? So where can you go? So the next step is going to be gathering background information. So you're asking these questions, you're making these observations. How can you take these questions and observations into like a formal research question, right? That's when you have to go and gather background information, or sometimes what people will call conducting a literature review. A literature review is going to be a little bit more formal. But in general, gathering background information, you can start with the news, you can start with the media, you can go watch a bunch of YouTube videos, right? And see, okay, what do I know about this really specific phenomenon, right? So going back to kind of our weather example, maybe I'll go and look up, summer's getting hotter and I see a bunch of news articles, or I look at a bunch of videos and they're all saying, oh, like global warming is like really contributing to this high heat, or climate change is, slowly happening. And so then maybe from there you take it to books or research engines. So a lot of times academics will publish entire books about a subject. So I've read books. I have a book here on, history of San Francisco, right? Or you can have a book on, connecting with others in psychology, or about different types of brains. So there's lots and lots of books. And then we can also find information from research engines, which I'll cover a little bit what they are in a moment, but essentially you read and you gather information from different journal articles. So when scientists publish research, they'll publish it in an academic journal, and each of their, pieces of research is in the format of a article. And so I think the reason I say to start with media and news is because when you look at, academic journal articles, they can be really hard to understand sometimes, especially if you're just starting a process and you're trying to figure out, what am I actually interested in? What do I want to learn more about? It's not easy to just start by looking at, academic articles on something. But when you get to that point, then you can start, writing down really important and specific points of information and learning more specifically about that area you've decided, and learning, the most current kind of information about that, right? So I think definitely when you're gathering that background information, it's a two-step process, because on one hand, you're gathering information to decide your research question, and then on the other hand, you're gathering information to learn more about your research question, right? To actually investigate that question. So again, it's not always a linear process. Sometimes you're going back and forth, and you have to go back to all these articles and continue to refer to them to figure out, what do I need to know from this article? How can I structure my own study? What have people before me done, right? Or, okay, I actually just thought about this new possible thing that could mess with my study. Like, have other people thought about that? So definitely, like, you're going to be working a lot with academic articles. So what is a research engine? Research engines are websites that contain millions of research articles and other academic resources. So I've listed a few here. I personally have used the first 3. I honestly highly recommend Google Scholar. I think it's a pretty good aggregator, and you can, include certain parameters and filters on your search to make it more specific and relevant to what you're trying to find. But essentially you just go and you find articles. Some of them will be open source, which means that you can just click it and the PDF will come up. Some of them, they want you to pay. If an article wants you to pay for it, please don't pay for it. There's other ways to get those articles, especially like if for some reason your school has a deal with a certain research engine, which most high schools don't, but a lot of colleges do. But if you can't access it open source, then continue to look for articles. There's a lot of times with research that people are interested in doing, there's so many similar articles that have been published. Like there's hundreds and thousands of pieces of information that academics are creating and putting into the world, right? And so to find something to just get you started, don't go and just be purchasing $30 here, $30 there. It's not worth it. You can usually find things open source. And sometimes if you find a specific article, you can kind of Google it and find a site where there is an open source. So something to keep in mind. But kind of taking it back to this step, which is, again, gathering background information, it also kind of coincides, right, with doing a literature review, which is a formal process of going through each of the things that academics have done previously, that researchers have looked at previously, pulling together all that information, right? Getting kind of the bylines, the summaries, pulling out key pieces of information and using that to give you a full understanding of the background of the topic that you're interested in investigating. So this is a really, 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 really important part of the process, and it will take a while. It will take a lot of time of just reading and reading and reading. I know when I was doing my thesis project, I was doing an absurd amount of reading for like months. And so and even when I got to later parts of the process, if I got confused about something, I would go and I'd find more articles and I would do more reading. So you're going to be doing a lot of reading, which means learning how to read a journal article, which we can definitely cover in another workshop, or I can talk to people one-on-one about. But a lot of reading and trying to understand and parse those things and combine that information. So it's challenging, but it's also, I would say, arguably probably the most important part of the process. Okay. So that kind of takes us to the next step, which is going to be to hypothesize. So when you hypothesize, you use all of that background information to try and predict the outcome of your research question as an educated guess, right? So I hypothesize that if this thing is happening, then this will happen, right? So I hypothesize that if the summers are getting hotter, then humans are contributing. Not the best hypothesis, but it works. Or I hypothesize that if I turn off my lights until the nighttime, then my electric bill will decrease 200%. Maybe better. It doesn't always have to be that specific, right? But that, my bill will decrease if I keep all my lights off as long as possible, right? So a hypothesis, like once you've kind of decided, okay, I want to investigate this question. So let's say my question is like, how can I get my electric bill to go down? You know, um, then I will kind of look into that investigation. I'll be like, okay, I think that if I, keep all my lights off and I unplug all my electronics, then I can get my bill to go down, which is a pretty good line of thinking, right? And so I'm making it, but I'm still kind of guessing, right? But if I've read, a bunch of articles on, electric consumption, maybe like, I'll find all these different things and I'll see that turning your lights off can decrease your bill significantly or decrease your electric output significantly, or that like by leaving all these things plugged in, I'm actually like sucking out all of like every minute they're plugged in, I'm wasting 25 cents. So all of that to say is your hypothesis is going to be based on, as I said before, doing all of that research, looking at all of those sources and trying to pull all of that information together. So the next step is to conduct your experiment. Now, when you conduct an experiment, you need to essentially decide on some sort of method. You have to figure out how you're testing your hypothesis, right? So, like I said before, maybe my hypothesis is that my electric bill will go down. So that's pretty easy to test, right? Because I've already decided what kind of my independent versus dependent variable is. And hopefully you know what that is already, because I'm pretty sure you learned that in science class in middle school. And if you're confused, I will explain more. I digress though. So I'm thinking, okay, my independent variable is going to be, whether or not I turn my lights off, or let's say whether or not I have, yeah, I'm going to go with lights because I have a good example for that. So I'm going to say if, okay, for the next 40 days, I'm going to turn all my lights off until 10 p.m. Right. So even if the sun goes down earlier, I'm going to keep my lights off until 10 p.m. And I'm only going to have them on from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. when I go to sleep. Right. So I'm only keeping my lights on for like 1 hour a day. And then my dependent variable is going to be the output, right? So that's going to be the electrical output, which I'm going to measure by my electric bill, right? Because for some reason I decided to do the dynamic PG&E bill, and I am going to just have to pay based on output instead of the fixed cost. I digress. So I'm going to know exactly how much electricity I'm using based on this bill. And so to test that, I've decided I'm going to do it in this way. I'm going to figure out how much it's going to cost me in a month. And then the next month, just to make sure that that's what the change was from, I'm going to keep all my lights on, right, all day long. And I'm just going to suffer the consequences, right? And then maybe the next month, I get a bunch of LED light bulbs, and I've decided that I'm going to try the LEDs instead. So you can kind of hear in this line of thought, I'm putting together this kind of method. And this kind of example would be quantitative research. So quantitative research and quantitative data is countable or measurable data. And you usually analyze this with statistics. So you can kind of imagine if I have these electric bills, right? And maybe I do this for a full year because I'm crazy. Or I force, all like 10 of my friends to do this, and I collect everyone's electric bills. Now I have all of this information. I know that, it's 1 hour a day, so I can put the number of hours, and you can kind of see how you could graph that information, right? And compare it to one another and compare it across these different conditions. And so you can analyze that with different statistics. I'm not going to go into what statistics here because, ouch. But you can kind of guess what that would look like. Another example, right, is like you can get, you don't always have to collect information on your own. You can find a database that has open source information and then conduct your own analyses on it. And so let's say the average temperature over the last 25 years. A lot of scientists have done this research already of seeing like what that global warming is a thing and that climate change is a thing, right? They analyze the temperatures over the last 25 years. I think a few days ago was like one of the hottest days on record. So we have a lot of information available online. And if I were to get to the next step, which we'll again talk about analysis a little bit more, I'm going to take every single piece of that data and I'm going to compare it to something else, right? Or I'm going to compare it across time, or I'm going to compare it in the US versus in Europe. So there's a lot of different ways you can structure an experiment and a method, but it all comes down again to the type of data, right? And so experimental design is kind of going to be the part of this experiment step. And that's going to be a lot of what's really, I think, difficult about doing independent research is knowing, what's the right way to test this thing, especially like I'm not a researcher who makes $200,000 a year, as an econ professor who can go have a, $100,000 grant to go collect a bunch of research, right? In case you didn't know, that's kind of how it works. But I don't have a bunch of money to go ask people to answer this question, right? Or I don't have a bunch of money to go and get all these instruments. So I think it can be difficult sometimes when you're doing independent research, at-home research without, a professor or without a teacher or without like specific equipment to kind of put those questions together. But that's part of my job is to help you think really creatively, right? About, like I said, maybe you can find a data set that already exists and you can ask a new question but already have data that's available. Or maybe, I want to answer this one question, but it's going to be really hard because I don't have this really specific type of instrument. Maybe I can come up with something that's adjacent, right? So this is experimental design. You get to be really creative, and you get to be really, specific about the way you want to collect things. The other side of this would be qualitative data. So qualitative data is descriptive, and this is relating to words, to language. So typically, like when we're thinking about qualitative data, we're thinking about like interviews or focus groups, things like that. When you go and you talk to someone, or another example of qualitative data sometimes is like just 1,000 Twitter posts. So anything that's kind of just like a bunch of words or language. I think when you're collecting data, typically it's going to be something like an interview or a focus group. You analyze this by kind of grouping data into themes or categories. Again, data analysis is a whole very tricky thing. We'll talk a little bit about it in a moment. But that's also going to be somewhere where you probably will need help, because I know I needed help from an adult when I was doing data analysis. But qualitative data can be really fun. So let's say, like, again, I'm interested in climate change, but I actually, have a very different type of question, or I want to do more exploratory research. I want to see actually, like, what is the impact on humans, right? But I can't really exactly go get the health records of 10,000 people. What I could do, though, is I could go interview, 10 people living in deserts, or maybe, I could interview 25 farmers who've lived in, Death Valley, right? So I'm going to go and ask these people a bunch of questions and then draw conclusions from there, right? And so that's another method, right? Like, instead of collecting these pieces of data or finding a database, I go and I ask questions in an interview, or I get a focus group together and ask questions. There's a lot of opportunities here, right? Or I try and gather qualitative data and I look at every Twitter post that's hashtagged, climate change, right? Which would be painful, but it's something you can do. So that's kind of what qualitative data looks like. And again, like, this experiment kind of step is really broad because there's so much contained in that. And so kind of coming back, reviewing that experiment step is going to be, again, experimental design. And within experimental design, what kind of data are we collecting? How are we going to answer this research question? And then actually going and collecting that data. And going and collecting data can sometimes be harder than you think, or it can involve learning new things and having to go back to the drawing board and reconfiguring your design. So it's a broad step. It's where kind of, I think, people typically think of the research process starting, but it's actually like the middle of the whole process. Okay, so then steps of the scientific method, the last two steps is going to be analysis and conclusions. So thinking about kind of analysis, this is when you take the data you collect and apply analytic techniques to gather an understanding of it. So as I said before, right, maybe I'm going to do a statistical analysis, right? So I've gathered, let's say I've gathered all my electric bills, right? And so now I'm going to take those electric bills and I'm going to graph them and I'm going to compare them and I'm going to say, and I'm going to draw conclusions. I used 85% less energy, or my bills cost, or really what you would actually find if you're looking at electric bills is going to be like my bill was 95% lower in this month and 85% lower in this month. Or I gathered the electric bills of 50 of my closest friends and family. I made them all do this really insane procedure just so I could get this information, right? And so I compared all of them. And with this, you would kind of do, I think, like a paired t-test. We don't have to get into the actual statistics unless you've taken AP stats. But I'm going to use this very specific statistical technique that will help me make a comparison, which will basically tell me, like, is it significantly different from before? And so I get an output that says, yes, it is different from before. And then I can draw more conclusions from that. So analysis can look like that when it comes to quantitative data collection. Qualitative data collection, as we talked about interviews and things like that, sometimes what it looks like is looking at all of your interview data, which would essentially be like all of the notes you've taken, or maybe you have a transcript and you take it and you sort it into, groups, into chunks. You read through all of it, you think about categories. Okay, when I was talking to people, a lot of them talked about how they have trouble breathing. So like breathing issues, right? Or like I talked to a lot of people and they said that like the days have gotten, like the working days that they're able to do have gotten shorter. So it's affected working conditions. Okay, so like working and this breathing, maybe that's health actually. And it's a lot of kind of configuring these different categories until you have these final kind of groups or themes. And with qualitative analysis, there's actually a lot of different ways you can do the analysis, but like thematic analysis, which I just described, is one of the most common ones. So analysis, right, is going to be a lot of taking your data, trying to figure out what to do with it so that you can then, final step, come to a conclusion. So when you draw a conclusion, you kind of look at the results of everything. You have all your numbers or your information, and you try and draw some conclusions and figure out, does my research actually answer my research question, right? So maybe I do the light bulb experiment. And so I do, month one, I turn all my lights off basically all day. Month two, I turn my lights on all day. And month three, I put in, LED light bulbs, right? And I just like turn them on and off as I normally would. So I'm looking at my different habits and seeing what they could, and I compare them all. And it actually turns out that, even though turning off my light bulbs was the lowest, right? Like the lowest bill, the LED bill was only, a little bit higher than that and still much lower than my initial electric bill. And so now my conclusion is like, okay, yes, right, turning all my lights off does decrease my bill, but that's not super helpful, right? Because now it's like, okay, well, I don't want to live with my lights off all the time. But I collected this other piece of information about LED light bulbs. And so now my conclusion is like, okay, turning all your lights off is important, but if you forget, maybe get an LED light bulb because it takes less energy, which is true. And so I know that, if I am really bad about turning my lights on and off, then I should get LED light bulbs. And you can configure that experiment in 100 different ways. But the conclusion, right, is about answering your research question and then figuring out, what are next steps about this? Like, how does this actually apply to the broader topic that I was interested in the first place? You can kind of think of the whole process as like a funnel. You start with this really broad observation, you kind of bring it in with learning more, with gathering background information until you get to like your research question, right? And your experiment. And then you start to analyze it. And then as you come to the conclusion, you broaden it again, right? And so I guess that's an hourglass, but right, you get really specific and then you broaden it again and try and think about how does this compare to other things and how does this, relate to science in general. So yes, that was a lot of information, much of it verbal. So if you have a question, feel free. But kind of the last little piece of the puzzle is how do I get started? And I could also have probably a full, very long presentation on how you should get started, but I'll just start with the first couple steps, which is going to be back to the beginning. Observe and question. Find a topic you're interested in. Observe the world around you, read the news, and explore. Remember before that we were talking about, the steps here. Let's see. We were talking about research engines. Research engines, these are a great place to start if you already know your topic. But if you don't, just start reading the news or look at media, or, if you're like, okay, I want to do something in STEM, then, find the tech section, right? Or watch some YouTube videos on different, different interesting things that you could ask questions about, or maybe you're interested in psychology, right? Go, go on TikTok. I don't care. Go watch videos or go on the news. Start somewhere, right? You have to start somewhere. Then you need to start developing a research question. So maybe that's when you go to the research engines, right? And you look at, okay, I know that I really, really want to know more about, mental health and how phones affect mental health, right? Okay, well, that's not really a question, right? So then I'm going to go read a bunch of articles now, like actual journal articles. So I really think like in terms of starting, you want to just start with exploration. And once you have an idea of a topic, then that's when you can come to me and you can come to the, other counselors and stuff, and we can kind of talk through, what do you want to, what do you want to actually look at? How can we make this a question? Like, how could we design this experiment, right? Because you could have a really big question that we can't exactly answer together. But if you have an idea of, what you kind of want to look at, continue to gather that information, refine your final question, um, and really get a good idea of, what you want to learn, what is important to you. Okay, so kind of a final review, we'll go back to the steps of the scientific method. So the research process is very systematic. It follows the same kind of through line of thinking almost every time. And it's really important to know that like you might not always get super interesting results, or you might get results that completely surprise you. And that is kind of the fun of doing research, is that you get to explore a completely new topic, you get to learn something new, and in the process, kind of develop your skills, right? You're going to observe, you're going to question, you're going to gather all of this information, you're going to make assumptions, you're going to make guesses, you're going to put together some sort of design, right? What's my independent variable? What's my dependent variable? Like, what am I testing here? What am I collecting, right? What types of things am I collecting? You really, like, the world is your oyster. And I mean that in the sense that, like, the idea of like research is so broad, which is why I started with this really broad thing, but each field, has its own way of conducting things. And I think it's really important to think about, how you can contribute, and also what's achievable, what's feasible for you to be able to do. And then finally, like, that analysis and those conclusions, right? Like, really picking apart your data, picking apart the things that you've looked at, and trying to draw conclusions from that and try and figure out what that means. Sometimes you will get, I guess what we call null results, right? You design this whole thing, and maybe, my electric bills all 3 months were the same. Right. And so my conclusion is essentially like, okay, maybe my energy output actually doesn't really affect my bill that much. And maybe I need to go find another reason why my bill varies, right? Or like maybe my bill only goes up and down a little too much, or it actually goes up when I turn all my lights off, right? But like, it's figuring out, it's the investigation and what we can actually analyze from those results that make it really interesting. Um, Okay, that didn't take as long as I thought it would. So I'll come to the end here.